Hello and welcome back to the MMA Girl podcast. Welcome to episode 22. I'm the MMA Girl, Jess, as usual. Thank you very much for tuning back in, and welcome to those who are new. Today we're on episode 22, as I just said, and we'll be covering all the fight news that's happened since the last time we spoke, which was not too long ago. But first of all, the biggest news of all is the UFC's new television deal. Of course, just dropped yesterday was their signing with Paramount and CBS for 7 years. Yes, you heard that right. A 7-year contract with the UFC for $7.7 billion. This means huge things for the fighters, huge things for the fans, and huge things for the UFC in general. The UFC will be on a bigger platform, will be on a bigger space for the biggest athletes and the biggest sports organizations, and we'll be getting the end of the permanent pay-per-view model, which means that for fans in the US and overseas, they'll be able to tune in to Paramount for every single UFC card without paying the pay-per-view prices. Now, the UFC have said the pay-per-view model isn't over, as Dana White just stated. The pay-per-view model isn't finished. The pay-per-views are not dead. They're just going to be a lot less. Now, CBS will take on some of the bigger cards, like, for example, the UFC's White House card will probably be on CBS as a pay-per-view. So pay-per-views will still be happening, but only a few times a year. So for most fight fans, we're going from, I think they calculated $1,080 a year as a UFC fan in the US to $150 roughly dollars per year as a UFC fan. So this changes everything for UFC fans. And of course, this changes everything for the UFC because now we have Paramount Plus that's going to be hosting the UFC. So everyone who has Paramount Plus that maybe wasn't a UFC fan or an MMA fan may now get into UFC because they're able to watch it for free on Paramount with their subscription, of course, which is great news. A lot of people are scared about what this could mean for the UFC. Will Paramount be upping their prices because the UFC are on there? I'm not really sure what's going to be happening, but at least I'm very happy to hear the UFC have finally broke a deal with someone who will be able to show the UFC's value to the world and showcase what we love on a bigger scale. And that will in turn help the fighters get paid more, as technically the UFC are getting a lot more money in for their TV deal, and therefore the fighters will get more money and the fighters will get more coverage, more sponsors, more followers, more fame, because they'll be on a bigger platform where people will be able to discover them easier. So I'm very happy for that. I'm very happy with the fighters. They're saying here that it's a historic deal, of course. Good for the fans, good for the fighters, more accessible for all. The first pay-per-view will be hosted by Paramount Plus and CBS will be UFC 323, happening, of course, in January. So as of January 2026, we'll be making the move over to Paramount Plus and CBS permanently for the next 7 years at least. And I hope this will bring some fabulous things from the UFC and for MMA in general. And maybe other sports organizations like the UFC will sign with Paramount and CBS and be able to showcase their fights and their sports on a bigger scale as well. So this is very good news for everyone involved. Right, so before I go into any UFC details, I want to cover PFL because PFL did their first PFL Africa events last weekend, and they went down with a bang. A lot of crazy KOs, a lot of crazy high kicks that knocked people out. It was an amazing event, but the glory of this event was tainted by the person that was missing from this event, the person that was in the ambassador for PFL Africa, and that is, of course, Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou pioneered this fight card to be in Africa. He, of course, asked the PFL to host regular Africa events. This is their second African event. They did, of course, an event in Cape Town where we saw Khabib, of course, bring one of his athletes to the event, and Khabib made a speech at the end saying how he loved Cape Town and how it was great. And obviously having now a second event in Africa, again missing Ngannou, not great. Of course, chairman and boss of PFL, Don Davis, has called out Ngannou following the fact that he was absent from both events and said that, he feels like he's been tricked, actually. He feels like Francis Ngannou played him and that he was not willing to turn up for his own events, as though he wasn't ambassador for the PFL Africa events. So very sad to see. He worked for 2 years with Francis Ngannou, very close, and unfortunately now the relationship seems to be breaking up between PFL and Ngannou. Ngannou, of course, not someone who can go back to the UFC, as some athletes have done in the past. He cannot really go back because Dana White and the UFC aren't interested in re-signing him. Maybe this new Paramount CBS deal will push the UFC to put their grudges aside and sign Ngannou, and Ngannou maybe wanting to sign back with the UFC, seeing as it's not going as well as he would have hoped at the PFL. But I'm not sure that will happen. So I would love to know what Francis is thinking right now, what his headspace is at, why he's absent from these events. So although he's ambassador for PFL Africa, and I'd love to know what he'd like to do in the future in combat sports. Will he be doing more boxing events? Will he be doing more MMA events? Will he be doing any MMA at all? That's what my question is. We're seeing a relationship that's quite messed up between Don Davis, PFL, and Francis Ngannou. So I'd love to know what happened behind the scenes to change that relationship and spoil it. But for now, Ngannou, we just have a lot of questions and not a lot of answers for the moment. So we'll be keeping up with that and staying tuned for any updates on PFL/Francis Ngannou. But for now, we know the PFL aren't too happy with Francis Ngannou, and Francis is not really saying anything much on his social medias to explain his absence at the PFL Africa event. So I'd love to know more later on. So this weekend we had UFC Vegas 109, and Fluffy, of course, Anthony Hernandez. Amazing fight between himself and Delidze. Wouldn't say it was an amazing performance from Delidze, but it was a dog walking from Anthony Hernandez on Delidze. Delidze got ragdolled, and I did not expect Delidze to get ragdolled in that way. Being the bigger man, being someone who, before the fight, obviously said he was looking to be the second fighter in the UFC from Georgia to have 10 wins at the UFC. That's not looking good right now. He needs to go back to drawing board because his performance on Saturday night was not good. But not to take anything away from Fluffy, of course, Anthony Hernandez was incredible from start to finish. It was a complete dog walking. It was a complete dominance. And apart from him, of course, he got performance of the night bonus. We also saw Elijah Smith with the Rampage Jackson-esque body slam into KO. It was brilliant and it worked very well. So Rampage Jackson, of course, took to Instagram and Twitter to announce that he had been emulated by Elijah Smith at UFC Vegas 109, and it was a brilliant KO finish that also earned Elijah Smith a performance of the night bonus. Now, we also had Justin Edwards with her round 1 KO over her opponent, which was incredible. Justin Edwards is not to be stepped on. She is an amazing fighter at the UFC, and I can't wait to see more from her. And she, of course, got a performance of the night bonus. And the last person who got a performance of the night bonus was Chris Leroy Duncan from the UK. He got the round 1 KO at the start of UFC Vegas 109 main card to kick off what was a brilliant card at the UFC Vegas event. And speaking of Vegas and the Apex, the UFC, of course, with their CBS Paramount deal, have also announced that they will be doing more events in the Apex as of now, and they're looking to expand the Apex, so work on the Apex in order to accommodate more fans. They're looking to accommodate between 1,000 and 5,000 fans in the Apex and hold more events in the Apex and have a more lively ambience, because of course UFC Apex events are quite quiet. There's not a lot of fans, there's not a lot of cheering, because of course it's mostly friends and family of the fighters and people that work at the UFC and other fighters who have come to watch the fights. So they're looking now to expand the UFC Apex in order to accommodate more fans and more people to make UFC Apex cards a little bit more lively. I don't really understand why they're doing that, because there's no comparison between Apex fights and arena fights. There's just no way of comparing them. But in making Apex fights more entertaining, I'm happy about that. But that means that UFC are going to look to use the Apex a bit more, and that's where I would be a little bit frustrated, of course, because for me, the Apex needs to be used less and less, and the arena shows should be more and more. So maybe the Apex is their hub for certain cards they don't want to do in arenas, and this will allow them to generate income from Apex cards. So maybe filling the Apex with 1,000 to 5,000 fans and generating income from the Apex events will help improve Apex fans and maybe change our perspective and our opinion of Apex fights as they are. We get some really nice finishes on Apex cards. So the fights speak for themselves. We got two Apex fight cards in a row, UFC Vegas 108 and UFC Vegas 109. And we got two Fight of Night bonuses on the UFC Vegas 108 event. Of course, Duncan versus Rebecca being the highlight fight of the evening. But there were two Fight of the Nights instead of having any Performance of the Night bonuses. So 4 fighters got 50K because they're great fights. And that was at the Apex. So nothing about the Apex bothers me apart from the background, apart from the fact there's not many people in there. So maybe that's what will help UFC fans to like the Apex a bit more. Anyway, great win for Yasmin Lucindo, who won, of course, her fight via unanimous decision against Angela Hill. So quite a shame for Angela Hill to lose that fight. It was a close one, but still got the unanimous decision. And of course, Lucindo, 23 years old, beating veteran fighters with fight IQs that through the roof, is very impressive. So I'm very happy for Lucindo. She has a very bright future ahead of her. And on the prelims card, we got quite a few amazing fights. Uros Medic versus Gilbert Bina finished with the first round KO. We got Justin Edwards, of course, as I said earlier, first round KO over her opponent. Elijah Smith, again, first round KO. So 2 of the Performance of the Night bonuses came from prelim fights. And then we had, of course, Anthony Hernandez and Chris Duncan with the finish in the first and last fight of the main card. What did you guys think of UFC Vegas 109? Did you enjoy watching this fight card? Did you watch UFC Vegas 109? Because I've got to know some of you really don't like Apex cards, so you don't watch them at all. But I really recommend watching them. And now they're going to be bigger. Maybe you guys, those who don't really like Apex cards, will be a little bit more happy to watch an Apex card. Let's move on to Arman Tsarukyan. Arman Tsarukyan, of course, the number one contender of the UFC's lightweight division. He has been helping Khamzat Chimaev at the Jackson gym in California with his fight camp. Of course, the fight is happening this Saturday at UFC 319 in Chicago, Illinois. But meanwhile, of course, Arman Tsarukyan has just announced that he has disclosed to the UFC that he is ready to fight for October. So he wants a fight. He just said, give me a name, I'll fight them. And then he said, from October, I'd like to fight in December, because Ilia Topuria has been announced that he is ready to fight and defend his belt once again in December of this year. And Arman Tsarukyan says, I want to fight in October and then I want to fight against Ilia in December. Now, the rumors are not saying that Ilia Topuria will be facing Arman Tsarukyan in December, of course. I'll get into that later on. But for now, of course, that's what Arman has said. So yet to know, of course, if the UFC have said, okay, no worries, we'll get you that fight in October. I think they probably will give him a fight in October if he says he's ready. He says he's fit, healthy, he's training twice a day. He's ready. I think the UFC will probably give him a fight, but he will have to earn a title shot. And as you guys know, Ilia Topuria does not want to give him a title shot, and the UFC seem to be giving him anything but title shots right now. So we'll see if he gets his title shot against Ilia in December, but I think it will be most likely next year that he'll get a title shot, depending on how his position in the UFC's lightweight division remains throughout the next few months. Speaking, of course, of UFC 319, we'll be seeing Dustin Poirier finally step into, finally, as if he retired 6 years ago. He retired at 318 and now we're getting 319. But so 1 month after retiring from in Octagon action, of course, Dustin Poirier had declared a couple of days after his retirement happened that he will be stepping into an analyst role with the UFC, and he will be, of course, starting his on-air analyst role at UFC 319 in Chicago. So very happy to hear, of course, that Dustin Poirier is starting his job straight away, and I can't wait to see him in his suit, jacked, as he's starting, of course, his steroid cycle. This is just crazy stuff, and I love to hear it. So let's go into Khamzat Chimaev officially. Of course, Khamzat, as I said, he's training at the Jackson gym right now. Rampage Jackson, of course, has his gym and podcasting area in California. He's got a whole warehouse with a lot of MMA material. A lot of huge names, of course, have fought and trained in the Jackson gym. And he was recently, he being Khamzat Chimaev, was recently pictured at the Jackson gym with none other than Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva, of course, who is no longer, of course, at the UFC, but he has been training with Khamzat Chimaev as if Khamzat needed any help training from Anderson Silva, even though Anderson Silva is a legend. Anderson Silva is currently preparing for his next fight, which will be in boxing, they've just announced. And this will be to complete his trilogy fight with Chris Weidman. So I'm very excited to see that happen, of course, when that will be announced, because everything's to be determined for now. We have no dates and no locations, no timing or anything, but he seems to be working on his skills and fine-tuning his skills in the gym, and this could mean that the fight will be announced very soon, and maybe we'll be getting the fight in the next few months. But anyway, Anderson Silva is, of course, training alongside Hamza Chimaev and Arman to prepare Khamzat the best way possible for his fight at UFC 319. Hamza Chimaev has apparently enormously benefited from working with Coach Cal. And Aaron Pico also joined Hamza Chimaev in the last week of his training with Coach Cal, because, of course, Aaron Pico will also be on the UFC 319 card in the co-main event against Lee Murphy. So things are heating up, and I can't wait to see this fight come together on Saturday. I can't believe we're already almost at the day of UFC 319, and it's happening this week, and I cannot wait. On other news, Martin Boudet, former UFC heavyweight contender, of course, was cut from the UFC recently, and no one kind of understood why. He was on a 3-fight win streak at the UFC. Yes, he has had a lot of performances that could be considered boring, a lot of lengthy decisions that he's had during his UFC fights, but that doesn't mean he was losing his fights. But because he's not an entertaining fighter and the UFC didn't want to keep him, he was cut from the UFC. And if you guys watch any of the Octagon MMA fight events, then you may have noticed that during the event, Martin Boudet made an appearance at the Octagon MMA event this Saturday, and it was the Octagon 74 event. And they brought him on stage to sign live his contract with Octagon MMA and face off the current heavyweight champion of their promotion. Now, this reminds me of when Cody Rhodes left the WWE, went to AEW, got seriously famous, seriously taken seriously, literally, and came back to WWE with a whole new status, a whole new respect for his name. And I really feel like this is the same thing that's happening to Martin Boudet. He was a former, of course, Octagon MMA fighter. He left Octagon MMA to join the UFC via the UFC's Contender Series. He had his time at the UFC. The UFC didn't want to keep him anymore. His contract was finished. They didn't ask to renew it. They cut him from the UFC, and now Octagon have signed him, and he's facing off with the Octagon MMA heavyweight champion, which means only one thing, that his next fight and first fight re-signed back at Octagon MMA will be against the heavyweight champ. That's crazy stuff, guys. That's Cody Rhodes vibes. So honestly, very excited for Martin Boudet, very happy that he was able to bounce back from him being cut from the UFC and back to Octagon MMA. Octagon MMA being one of the biggest and the best promotions in MMA in Europe. So he's in good hands right now. Don't be worried about Martin Boudet. He's doing just fine. Now, last update coming from Anthony Joshua. Now, last week I spoke about Anthony Joshua because he was apparently in serious talks with Jake Paul's team to finalize the date and location for their fight, as we are apparently very much getting Jake Paul versus Anthony Joshua. However, Anthony Joshua seems to be confirming recently that he will be fighting Tony Yoka. Tony Yoka being a French boxer who is making waves in boxing currently and is a prospect in the heavyweight division in boxing. And Anthony Joshua is supposedly confirming that the next fight for him on his last leg of his career, of course, being that Anthony Joshua may retire in the next couple of years, the last leg of his career will contain, of course, a Jake Paul fight, but not straight away, because he will be fighting Tony Yoka before stepping into the ring with Jake Paul. That's all the news I have on Anthony Joshua. Can't wait to hear any fight announcement that come up for him. But if he's having a fight against Tony Yoka, I will be staying tuned for that, because I love Tony Yoka. I love Anthony Joshua. And I can't wait to see how Tony Yoka deals with the legend that is Anthony Joshua. So let's get into, I don't know why I'm doing this. Let's get into the official fight announcements that have been coming up since we last spoke. Of course, the biggest thing that has come up since we last spoke was the announcement that Mr. Charles Oliveira will be taking on Rafael Fiziev at UFC Rio on October 11th. We will be seeing the return of Charles Oliveira, Charles Dubronx, and he'll be facing Rafael Fiziev. Now, a lot of people, of course, ask the question, why is he main eventing with Rafael Fiziev? Rafael Fiziev, he's looking good right now. Of course, he just won at UFC Baku in his home country, Azerbaijan. He had his co-main against Justin Gaethje, and he unfortunately lost via unanimous decision, but it was a great fight against Justin Gaethje nonetheless. And now he's been put up against someone he probably admires, probably respects enormously in the lightweight division. And it's been announced we're getting Vicente Luque coming back, who will be taking on Santiago Ponzinibbio. And Ponzinibbio, of course, he is a very dangerous fighter. Vicente Luque coming off a loss against Kevin Holland. He's, of course, looking to get back in that win column. He is on home soil, so it'd be very much a shame to lose against Santiago Ponzinibbio, being from Argentina, Vicente being from Brazil. He has to win this fight for his people, but I'm excited to see this fight at welterweight. I can't wait to see what happens at UFC Rio. There's been a fight added on to UFC Perth, happening, of course, the 28th of September. We're getting, of course, in the headlining fight, Dominic Reyes versus Carlos Ulberg. And in that fight card, we're getting Jimmy Crute versus Arslan. We're getting Junior Tafa versus Aslan. We're getting quite a few people, Tom Nolan versus Evan Elder. But we're going to be getting also Navajo Sterling versus Rodolfo Bellato. We last saw him against Scotsman Paul Craig, where they had a very confusing, bizarre fight that happened, that ended in a no contest, of course, with an illegal strike to the face that knocked him out without knocking him out. We don't know what happened, but the UFC giving Rodolfo Bellato another fight, which means that they weren't disapproving of his behaviour and his last fight against Paul Craig. Nonetheless, Navajo Sterling will be taking on Bellato, and I think it will be a whole nother game park for Rodolfo and a whole nother kind of fight for both guys. So very excited to see Navajo Sterling back in the Octagon. He's a very interesting fighter, and he, of course, trains at CKB with Israel Adesanya and Dan Hooker, notably. So he's got the same coach as these guys. He's got a huge potential at the UFC, and I can't wait to see what's next for him at light heavyweight. So that's to look out for at UFC Perth. We also have UFC Vancouver happening on the 18th of October. So 1 week after UFC Rio, we're getting UFC Vancouver. UFC Vancouver being, we don't know what the headline fight will be, but what has been confirmed is Marlon Chito Vera, who is coming back after months and months and months since his last loss, unfortunately, to Davidson Figueiredo. And we're going to be seeing Chito take on Ayman Zahabi, who is, of course, from Canada. So we're getting the Canadian in the fight. Chito, of course, coming back. Can't wait to see that fight. Can't wait to see Chito back in the Octagon, because we've been seeing him streaming with a lot of people like Neon, for example, but we've not seen Chito back in the Octagon. I've not seen any training footage from Chito in such a long time. So I can't wait to see him back in full bantamweight contender mode, full training mode, full camp mode, and can't wait to see him take on Ayman Zahabi in Vancouver. So stay tuned for that fight card. We're going to be obviously getting more and more announcements for that fight card as the days progress. Let's move on to the fight rumors, the targeted fights, the things that aren't set in stone, but that we're hearing little whispers, of course, about these fights that could be happening very soon. Now, for UFC Vancouver, of course, as I just said, we're having Chito Vera versus Zahabi. No word yet if that's the main event. It could be, but for now we have that on the card, which is definitely, of course, on the main card. The rumoured fight for that card, however, is Cody Garbrandt, no love, coming back to face Charles Air Jordan from, of course, Quebec, who, representing his home country, would be a great addition to this card, and can't wait to see Cody Garbrandt if that happens, of course, but that's just a rumour for now. This fight is targeted for the main card of UFC Vancouver. Another fight that's been targeted for UFC 322, happening, of course, in MSG, November 15th, is Bilal Muhammad versus Sean Brady. Now, this would be a great fight card for the welterweight division, and I don't know if the UFC are doing it deliberately, but a lot of the fight cards at the moment, especially UFC's October fight cards, are heavily based on one particular fight division. Now, let me give you an example. For example, UFC 320, which is, of course, happening on October 4th, will be featuring Ankalaev versus Alex Pereira 2. And on the same night, we're getting Yuri Prochazka versus Khalil Roundtree Jr. Now, these two fights are very much linked, because the first fight affects the second fight, because the first fight will determine the contender for the next fight's winner. And the same thing happens on October 25th, at UFC 321 in Abu Dhabi. We're getting, of course, in the main event, Tom Aspinall versus Cyril Gane. And on the same card, we're getting another heavyweight fight between Jailton Almeida and Alexander Volkov, which will determine, of course, again, the number one contender for the winner of the main event. So I quite like how this is going. I think if they're doing it deliberately, then I noticed. If they're not, then it's just a great happy coincidence. But I think seeing as it's happening quite a few times in a row, I think UFC are going to try to draw more attention to the main events division situation by putting more fights from the same division in the main card of that same fight card. So Belal Muhammad versus Sean Brady being, of course, maybe a number one contenders fight for the welterweight division could be a great fight to precede at MSG the JDM versus Islam Makhachev fight in the main event, which has not been announced yet. Of course, that was a rumor that we heard from Khabib last week, but I think if Khabib says it, then of course Islam must be in camp ready and waiting for JDM in November. But if we get Sean Brady versus Belal Muhammad, that will be a true number one contenders fight, and Sean Brady is looking to fight, so I'm very happy that he's getting what he wants and what he's asked for. But Sean Brady says since his last win over Leon Edwards at UFC London in March, he's looking to get back in the Octagon as soon as possible to solidify his place as number one contender in the welterweight division. Now, the last rumor that I have for you guys today, and the last bit of information on today's podcast, is for UFC 323, which is happening in December, as I said earlier. And I said to you guys earlier on in this podcast that Ilia Topuria is coming back in December, which has been confirmed by the UFC and himself, Ilia Topuria. Now, the rumored fight he'll be getting at UFC 323 in December will be against Justin Gaethje. Now, this is not official at all, but a lot of people are saying it's officially signed. We've not had word, of course, from UFC if that's true or not. But either way, that is apparently the targeted fight for UFC 323 and the next title defense of Ilia Topuria in the lightweight division. So Justin Gaethje is officially getting what he wanted. He asked for a title fight. He does not want to fight anyone else apart from the champion. If he needs to wait, he'll wait. But he did not want anyone else other than Ilia Topuria. We'll see what happens, of course, but Ilia Topuria is likely, of course, to win that fight again, as he did over Charles Oliveira, as he did over Max Holloway, as he did over Alexander Volkanovski, and I can continue until next week if you want. But Justin Gaethje is getting what he wanted, and that's what the most important thing is. I believe he has a point when he says he deserves to get this fight, because he has been there when the UFC have needed him for co-mains that have flopped or fight cards that needed him in it. He's been there, but this time around, he's getting what he wants, and he's getting what he deserves, regardless of what the outcome will be, regardless of what we think the outcome will be, at least. And on that same card for UFC 323, we may also be getting a double belted fight night, as we did when Juliana Pena took on Kayla Harrison, and Kayla Harrison, of course, won the UFC's bantamweight women's belt. And then we just had after that in the main event, Ankalaev versus Alex Pereira. So that card was amazing because we had two major title fights in the same night. Then we had, of course, Ilia Topuria versus Charles Oliveira, and preceding that fight we had Alexander Pantoja versus Kai Kara-France for the UFC's flyweight belt. Now we may be getting at UFC 323 again, Ilia Topuria versus another person for his belt, and as the co-main, Alexander Pantoja again fighting to defend his belt another time. He wants to defend his belt another 2-3 years to beat any records that have been held by anyone in the UFC as the most title defenses, and that, of course, will be breaking Mighty Mouse's record. So if Joshua Van cannot stop the wrath of Alexander Pantoja at UFC 323, if that happens, as it's targeted but not confirmed, then Pantoja is on the way to beating Mighty Mouse's record. Now, this is not confirmed, as I said, but this could be the UFC 323 co-main event, and if it is, then I'm all for it. And I would love to see this happen. So I'm excited to know if any of these rumored fights are actually going to come to fruition. So I'm very excited for that.